Well, welcome to episode 421 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And as promised, this is the 5th anniversary edition, 5th anniversary episode, I guess. As threatened, this video will have an Ask Me Anything segment. In fact, that's pretty much the whole video because so many people were kind enough to write in with questions that I feel I need to do justice to all of them. I have combined quite a few, as you might imagine, but there's still quite a few to get through. I was fortunate to have the cooperation of the noted Australian discographer, Sir Bruce Deadwax, who happened to be in town and who agreed to put the questions to me. And so my thanks to him and my thanks to all of you for your questions and to all the viewers for supporting the channel over the last 5 years. Here's the interview. Right, mate, may I first say what an honour it is to be asking you questions on such an auspicious occasion. Thank you so much, Sir Bruce. You're very kind. Fire away. Righto, let's get down to it. Question 1. I still don't fully have a clear reason why I'm buying LPs when I already have the CDs or can easily listen on a streaming service. Interesting question. I am not a vinyl Jesuit. I believe very firmly that you can have a very happy life listening to high quality music digitally or on cassette tape or CD or what have you. It doesn't have to be records, but here is why I like records. I've got at least 6 reasons. First of all, I grew up with them and I think that is just something that makes them familiar and comforting and just part of my life. Secondly, and again, these aren't in any particular order, I love the art and in particular on jazz records, the liner notes on a physical record. It's not the same. I mean, you can replicate all of that stuff on a jewel, inside a jewel case, but it's not really the same. And so I just love the physical thing, the holding of the cover. Third, whatever it is about the sound of vinyl records, I'm not going to say, oh, it's better or worse, because I know there's, far more bloodhound-eared kind of people who discuss those kinds of things. Whatever it is about the sound of vinyl records, I like the sound of vinyl records. I like the sound when the needle goes down. I like the slight rumble. I like the slight crackle. I love the warmth, as people often say. The fourth reason I think I prefer listening to records is that once you get a relatively well-developed and sophisticated jazz collection, I'm not saying I'm super sophisticated, but my collection is better than it used to be, and it's kind of getting more specialized in terms of my interests. You realize when you get to that point, there is a lot of music that you can't find on streaming sites. Or if you find it, it's kind of atomized into one song on one compilation, another song on another compilation. A lot of the music that I've been really into on smaller labels coming out in the 1950s is hard to find in that format, in that sequence on streaming sites. The fifth reason that I like records is that you are forced, unless you physically get up and do something about it, to listen to the record all the way through, which is a piece of the artist's and the record company's intention, which you don't have if you're just picking songs randomly. And a sixth reason, I guess, is that I love the provenance of used records. The idea that some other jazz fan or music fan 20, 30, 40, 60 years ago had this record, enjoyed it, played it, lay around on their living room floor. Perhaps you find that people will put their return mailing address stickers. People don't have those anymore, but they used to when I was a kid. Everybody's parents had return mailing stickers. They put their return mailing stickers on the inner label, or they put them on the back cover, or they lovingly write their name and address on the back cover, which allows me, in my kind of detective guise to look these people up and find where they live and find out interesting things about them and so on. I love that stuff. You don't get that with digital music. You don't really get that with CDs. Righto, look, my question is about the Voice of America collection you helped assess and organise. I saw that the buyer sold what was originally kept after all that triage. Did you get a chance to buy anything from the collection, or did you receive records as compensation? I've answered this question in part in responses to some comments on the site, but I guess I can give a fuller comment here now. Yeah, the subsequent sale of the collection to Noble Records happened in a big hurry. I know it happened in a big hurry, and there are reasons for that, and they're good reasons, but they're not reasons that I'm going to go into here because they're not my reasons, and that's not my business. I just do know that it happened in a hurry. It was, I think, the collection which was ultimately sold to Noble Records for resale, in my humble opinion, was one of the great privately held jazz vinyl collections around. I mean, I don't know how you score these things, but it was a really good collection, and we reckoned that it was worth a substantial amount. Those 5,000 or so records, I forget exactly how many it was, were, in our estimation, worth far more than the original price paid for the whole bunch of 100,000 records. My trajectory in this was as follows. I went down to do some reconnaissance at the invitation of the buyer in August of last year. I then went down again in just before the federal election, late October, early November, with a colleague. We were compensated for our work. We spent a week there. We pulled out that collection. I think with, again, all due humility, we did a pretty good job of that. And what I'm slightly heartbroken about is that we did have another plan. I was actually planning to go down to DC in the first weekend of May, and I was going to be accompanied on that trip by a documentary filmmaker from Philadelphia who makes movies about collectors and had been following the channel and following the story and was very interested. And he was going to follow myself and the collection owner around for a couple of days with a film crew. And who knows what would have come of that. It would have been kind of fun. But then, as we all know, in January this year, the U.S. administration changed, and the tone towards the country I live in, coming out of the White House, was, I don't think I'm being partisan to say it was disrespectful. And like a good Canadian, I didn't feel I could go down to the United States and in a discretionary way and spend money, so I canceled my trip. And as it happens, the collection ended up being sold a few weeks before I would have ended up going down there, so it would have been, probably aborted in any event. So that's the story. I would like, at some point when the dust is all settled, to go back and do some kind of catch up with the owner, maybe with Noble himself, and tie a bow on all this. I will say too, parenthetically, that it's sometimes I've read comments saying, well, how could the Voice of America have let this get into private hands, etc. Thank God they did last year, because had this happened this year, I have every expectation that the people who've taken over the Voice of America would not have paid much attention to being duly diligent about the disposition of that collection, and it might well have all gone in the dumpster. So I'm grateful that ultimately all those records found their way into the hands of people who want to listen to music, and that to me is the best possible outcome. Right, this next one's clearly from Queensland. Do you have any thoughts on the limitlessness of jazz? Do I have thoughts about the limitlessness of jazz? Well, I'm not really one of those people who stays up at night worrying about what is jazz or what isn't jazz. I mean, I think I know jazz when I hear it. Even though there are so many different kinds of jazz, what is fundamentally unifying, I guess, is the role of improvisation. That said, there are other kinds of music which have improvisation which aren't jazz. So, I've listened to probably 200 versions of Dazed and Confused, which all sound very different and all have different improvisational components. But Zeppelin is not a jazz band. So, I think the question, is jazz limitless, really drives you pretty quickly to the question of what is jazz. And I think that's probably not a very fruitful conversation. I will say that I think there is always music which is complex and emotional and virtuosic and challenging, which is going to appeal to a segment of the population. And jazz ticks a lot of those boxes, and I suspect it always will. And the sheer possible combinations of melodies and notes and so on mean that the opportunities for jazz to tickle our fancies is effectively limitless. And I think that will always be the case. Righto. How do you gain exposure to new jazz musicians and generally keep up to date on the scene, new trends, etc.? I think if I sat here and claimed that I'm up on all new jazz musicians, that'd be pretty fraudulent because I'm absolutely not. In fact, I think it's very difficult to be up on any particular kind of music these days, jazz or otherwise, because music is so atomized. There's no consistent set source like in the 1950s where you might have had, a dozen, maybe 2 dozen record labels pumping that music out from a very small number of cities where it was generated through a distribution network, which led to a very predictable flow of music into your local environment. That was relatively simple. Now there are a bunch of different platforms. You've got to learn how to use those, which is fine. I mean, I don't want to be that old guy complaining, but it's more complex. All that said, there's lots of contemporary artists that I follow and make a point of keeping up with. Esperanza Spalding is one. I've got a little list here. Vijay Iyer is another. Jakob Bro, Brandy Younger, the wonderful harpist. Micaiah McCraven. Nalis Sinefro, there's a question coming up later about her. Isaiah Collier, Alpha Mist, Shabaka Hutchings, Wildflower, I think they're defunct now, Nubia Garcia. Anyway, all those folks I dig, and if I see new stuff by them, I grab it. Now, at least half of those musicians I discovered for the first time in a club before I'd ever heard of their records. But I live in a fairly small city in Canada, so how did I accomplish that? Well, whenever I travel, I make it a point to go to the very best jazz clubs that are there, and I make it a point of listening to who's ever there. And as it happens, the good jazz artists tend to congregate in big cities and play in the better jazz clubs, so your odds start to narrow. And it was in that way that I first heard Esperanza Spalding, Jakob Bro, Vijay Iyer, Isaiah Collier, Brandy Younger. Anyway, I wouldn't call myself up to date, but between that practice and the practice of regularly Googling to see what's new, what's happening, and streaming a few things just every few months is, I think sufficient. If something is really good, it'll probably find its way to your ears if you're showing enough interest. Righto. If you could choose only one genre or period of jazz or even a single musician's output to take to the proverbial desert island, what or who would it be? So that's a question which, the answer to which changes all the time. If you'd asked me when I was 9, I think I would have said Hard Day's Night, Bachman Turner Overdrive's record Not Fragile, and probably Kiss Alive. But more seriously, as a proper grown-up man, I think if I had to narrow down what I was taking to this proverbial desert island, I might say Hard Bop on Blue Note from 54 to 59. I might say the spiritual jazz, which came out on Impulse between, say, 67 and 73. Or maybe pretty much anything which came out on contemporary records between 1954 and 1959. And as for picking a single musician, well, that's almost impossible. But if I had to, at the point of a gun, give one answer, the answer I would give would almost certainly be one of Horace Silver, Bill Evans, or Antonio Carlos Jobim. Righto. Is there a period in jazz that's underrepresented in your collection that you'd like to explore? I will say, when I look at my collection compared to collections of other people I know, that jazz records released between 1980 and 2000 are vanishingly rare in my collection. I've got some more contemporary stuff. I have a lot of old stuff, but I don't have much for those 2 decades. I was never, ever big on the new traditionalists, Wynton Marsalis and others. I was never that motivated to listen to latter-day end-of-career stuff by people who were at their peak in the 1950s and 1960s. I didn't like the art or the flimsiness of records in the 1980s. That kind of turned me off. I loved the older, thick, heavy, durable feel of records. That's a strange reason, but it's true, however. And then once you get to the 1990s, almost everything is on CD for the next 15 years, so there's very little original music being released on vinyl. I have a feeling, it's helped out by some nudging from a colleague, but I have a feeling that exploring Soul Note and Black Saint from the later 80s and the 1990s is going to be a rewarding thing. I have, I think, 1 or 2 of those records, but I think there's a lot of good stuff on there. I'm also gradually opening my ears to the pre-war sound, and in particular, I've spent a lot of time listening to the 1930s orchestras of Duke Ellington and Count Basie, and also Fletcher Henderson. And in all of that, I've also come to the conclusion that I'm very guilty of ignoring the really good early work of Louis Armstrong because of his, I guess, the sort of commercial nature of his later work. Right, Blue, how did you find your way into jazz? So jazz was some of the earliest music that I ever heard, even though I probably didn't know it was jazz at the time. And there were 5 records in particular, which my dad had, and I have bought my own copies of all of these, which were highly influential for me. And they were Getz Gilberto, Dave Brubeck's Time Out, Jimmy Jeffries' The Train in the River, Antonio Carlos Jobim's Wave, and Monty Alexander's Here Comes the Sun. That last one is probably a bit of a wild card because it's not as well known as the first 4, but those 5 records I played a lot and listened to a lot, and my parents played them a lot, and they were just part of my youth. However, growing up, I never bought jazz records. I was very much into, I was a rock fan. As a kid, I listened to all the bands that you might imagine, the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, the Kinks, Black Sabbath, and so on and so forth. When I was in university and decided to become a young sophisticate, I experimented a bit by buying jazz. I bought, in particular, something I'd seen a concert of on TV, which was Stefan Grappelli and David Grisman doing a concert together, and I have that record, and it's terrific. I also bought a Miles Davis sampler. I think it's called Basic Miles. Anyway, it's a greatest hits record. It's kind of funny to think of Miles Davis having a greatest hits record, but it's a greatest hits record, and I bought that. And that was kind of it. That's in my 20s. And I didn't really get seriously into jazz again until I was in my late 30s and early 40s, and my gateway drug was acid jazz. I was going to parties and clubs and hearing this great music and wondering where it all came from. And so I was buying all these different CDs, samplers, impulse samplers, other kinds of reissues and compilations of a lot of the soul jazz from the 1960s, some of the spiritual jazz, and some of it was remixed, and there was contemporary stuff that was being written and played as well. But it was all channeling a sound which really was decades older. But, that was all on CD. I'd actually given away my vinyl collection when I was in my later 30s. And things stayed that way until about 10 years ago, when I went to an auction and not intending to buy anything, and a lot of records comes up. And I was not intending to buy them. I didn't have a turntable. And the price of the records, this is a box of 100 LPs, mixed stuff, and I hadn't even looked through it, didn't really know. I did know that the 3 albums they'd put in the front of the photograph were good records. Anyway, the asking price went down to $2. And I thought, well, okay, whatever. Long story short, that night I left the auction house having spent $100 on 400 LPs and this 1978 Harman Kardon integrated amplifier and a JVC turntable, which I no longer use, but I still use the amplifier. And that was the start of it. I went through those records, and as with any auction buy, 20% was great, and the other 80% went to Goodwill. And I kept doing that. And the first 1,000 or so of the records in my collection were acquired very quickly by buying up everything that was being sold off through estates and auctions locally here that I could get my hands on. Now, a couple of years after that, I started to get a lot more selective. And so the remainder of my collection, which is now something like 22 or 2,300 records in total, was acquired much more painstakingly, researching, listening, learning, reading liner notes, digging, and learning how to use Discogs in a strategic way. By the time I started the channel in about 2020, I was deep into the research. I had something like 1,500 records, I think, at the time. I was exploring all the various subgenres of jazz very religiously. I devoted a lot of time to this during the pandemic, as I think, we all found our own hobbies. And all the time, too, I'm reading about jazz, I'm reading about social history, and I'm reading about related things. Longtime viewers will know that this didn't start as a jazz channel. It started as an everything in Allan's collection channel, I guess you could call it. But after the first year or so, there were a variety of reasons why I narrowed down to jazz, but one of them was that I realized I was on this learning journey with jazz, and that the videos that I was making about records and about styles of jazz that I was really passionate about at that time were good videos and were getting a lot of uptake from viewers, whereas records that were somewhat more historical, records that I'd known for years and that everybody has known for years, they just didn't have the same energy, at least not for me. You know, having taught at the university level, I can tell you that the very best classes that you ever teach are the ones where you're still actively learning the material as you're teaching it. So I guess the answer to this question is that jazz has been in my life since I was a little kid. I've had fluorescences of interest in it, but it's really been my passion for the last decade. Yeah, all right, look, could you expand on any of your Canadian brethren in the jazz arena that impress you for our consideration? You know, it's funny, when I look back through the channel, I'm not the biggest Canadian jazz booster, and in fact I have reviewed a few, well, I think really only Oscar Peterson records, and I'm not that wild about Oscar Peterson. I guess if I have to pick some favorite Canadian jazz artists, I mean ultimately it's an American jazz form, Canada, Britain, France, other countries all have their contributions, but that's not where the great stars and originators of the music lived. But if I have to pick my favorite Canadian jazz musicians, I would pick Paul Bley. I'd certainly pick Gil Evans. In a more contemporary vein, I'm fairly fond of Diana Krall. There's lots of other folks that people will mention. You know, I've got a list here including Maynard Ferguson, who I really don't care for, I have to say, because I just find his work a bit kind of brash and shrill. Salome Bay, Ed Bickert, Michael Bublé, of course you can watch him on The Voice and so on, Lenny Breau, Kenny Wheeler and so on. But for me, if I do make a point of listening to Canadian jazz musicians, and I don't really make that a point, it's Paul Bley, Oliver Nelson and Gil Evans. Cheers, good on you, Blue. Do you play any instruments? Well, I'm more of an owner of instruments than a player of instruments. I taught myself to play guitar when I was 20, and I practiced really, really hard for the next 25 years and came to terms with the fact that after that extensive apprenticeship, I still really sucked. And so I suppose I'm the cliche of the frustrated musician who's thrown himself into criticism. Right, Blue, when you go through the records you've already reviewed, which ones would you still keep and recommend, and which ones do you feel the impression's somewhat diminished? You know, that's a really interesting question, and I guess it's time to confess that there are some records that I've reviewed on this channel that I've subsequently gotten rid of. There's no harm in getting rid of records. I think it's a very healthy practice, and I'll talk more about that in a second. I haven't given away or sold any of the jazz records that I've reviewed. Rock records, however, I have gotten rid of several. I got rid of the Grace Slick one. I also got rid of Beastie Boys record. I got rid of a Gentle Giant record. I got rid of a Humble Pie record, all of which I had reviewed on the channel. All the rest of the records that I've reviewed absolutely are keepers. And in fact, I only really these days review records that I really like. And therefore, one of the things I'm thinking about doing is getting rid of my stars rating at all, because if I'm talking about it, I like it. If I don't like it, why would I talk about it on the channel? Crikey. Right, next question. Which books on jazz would you recommend? This is a question I get now and then, and it's true. I wouldn't say I have a library of jazz books. It's not really very big at all. I've got like maybe 30 or 40, but I find some of them in particular invaluable in fleshing out some of the details, you know, when I'm pulling together a review, or I'm just sort of interested in digging up something. Some books are absolutely essential. I'll probably do a video on this at some point, but I'll say for now the indispensable ones that I have come across include Coltrane on Coltrane. That's a compilation of everything he ever said in interviews. Lewis Porter's biography of Coltrane, which is fascinating, a bit musicological, but still fascinating. Miles Davis's autobiography, and Miles not only talks about his own life, but all kinds of other people as well, and he played with so many people, and he knew so many people. It's a little window into lots of different jazz biographies. Art Taylor's Notes and Tones, that's a fantastic book where people really open up about some of the non-musical issues within the jazz world. And of course, Ted Gioia's two books, his History of Jazz, which I think is an absolutely necessary book, an indispensable book. You must have it, you must read it if you're interested in the genre. It's a little bit buttoned up for my taste at times. I actually prefer his book on West Coast jazz. That's a really fascinating book, and I think also a really necessary book, and I'm so glad that he wrote it. Yeah, look, what one song is your favorite at the moment? My favorite song. Well, there's another question. Well, there are several songs I would say that come back to me every now and then and become a favorite for a while. One of them is the version of Whisper Not, which is on Shelly Mann's live record at the Black Hawk. That I think is fantastic. Another one is Grover Washington Jr.'s Mr. Magic. Another song I love is Themby by Pharoah Sanders. I also dig the Curtis Counts Group's rendition of How Deep is the Ocean. And I think if you don't find yourself moved by It Don't Mean a Thing by Duke Ellington, the one with Ivy Anderson singing, maybe you don't like jazz at all. So those are all songs which come back to me regularly as favorites. But if there's one song which will always get me to tell everyone else to shut up so I can listen to it or to pay attention because it's so good, it's Turiya and Ramakrishna by Alice Coltrane. Righto, what kind of chickens do you have? We have two chickens. We have a black chicken and a red chicken. I don't know what kinds of chickens they are. Maybe the red chicken is a Rhode Island red. The black chicken is a sole survivor of a flock of 7, 4 of which were assassinated by my stepdaughter's dog, 2 of which were dispatched by a mink, and the red chicken was bought to become a new companion to the now solitary black chicken. Although companionship in chickens, I would say, is not extensive. Right, now, next question. Is that an electric log in your fireplace? Yes, it is an electric log, and we got it because we looked at a whole bunch of those, so-called inserts. On the other side of that fireplace is a real fireplace that actually burns wood and we use all the time. But on this side, in this room, we wanted to have an insert, or so we thought, but they all were so goddamn ugly, full of weird flames and crystals and this sort of thing, that I said, my grandparents used to have a little plug-in fireplace, which looked kind of tacky, but it kicked out some heat. Anyway, we found out that's called a log set, and this was the best reviewed log set on Amazon, and it actually is fantastic. And so if you are interested, DM me and I'll let you know the details. Right, cheers. Can you recommend accommodation when visiting New York? So I'm not Rick Steves, and this is not a travel channel. I have stayed in Manhattan a few times, well, more than a few times, but a lot of times I wasn't paying because I was there on business. When I've been there on my own dime, I've stayed in Hell's Kitchen at what was once a Hampton Inn. I think it's now called Romer's Hell's Kitchen. My wife and I once stayed at a hotel just on Bryant Park. I think it's, I looked it up, it's 24 West 40th, but that's condos now. Most recently, my daughter and I went to New York, as some of you will know, in February, and we had originally booked into the Embassy Suites by Hilton on 37th, which was absolutely depressing and dismal, and we checked out the same hour we checked in, and we hustled up to the Sheraton, Times Square, which, is nothing to write home about, but it has something that most New York hotels don't have, which is great big rooms. It was reasonably clean. It was a block away from MoMA, right across the street from all the Broadway theaters, so it was, and also right by a subway station, so very well situated, and I felt we got good value. So if I'm going to recommend a hotel in Manhattan, I would say stay at the Sheraton, but what do I know? Yeah, look, what do you reckon is your greatest find in a record shop? Greatest find in a record store? Well, there's a number of candidates for that, I guess. Nothing particularly earth-shattering, but I guess the honorable mentions would go to, first of all, this one, Blue City by Isao Suzuki and his quartet. Funnily enough, I got this in Japan. I had just been in a listening bar where the guy was playing this for me on CD and saying what a great record it is and how hard it is to find. And literally the very next day I walked into a record store and I found this for not very much money, I have to say, and it is a wonderful record. Anything by Three Blind Mice sounds amazing, and this is no exception. So anyway, that's one. The next two I got more locally. One in a little record store in Victoria. It's not the original. It's actually an OJC, but it's an original OJC of John Wright's trio record, South Side Soul. It's in absolute mint condition. It is almost impossible to find the original. And so this is largely the best you can do, and this goes for a lot of money. They were not asking a lot of money at this store, very little. In fact, I think I got this for something like $15. Anyway, it's a tremendous record, and I was clicking my heels, I have to say, when I found this one. And then the other one is a record that I found for about $15 in Vancouver at a record shop. And it is this one, an original 1958 pressing of Benny Golson's New York Scene, which I got for about a tenth, I suppose, of its market value. And the cover is a little bit battered, but the vinyl inside is pretty minty. So anyway, this is lovely, and it's a fantastic record too. Incidentally, this has the original version of Whisper Not recorded as well. So there we are. But the record, which was probably my greatest ever find, wasn't actually a record store buy. It was in that very first lot of records that I bought and that I just told the story about. And that was a box of records that I spent probably no more than $10 on, if I recall correctly. Anyway, in there were a bunch of records that I still have, but the best one of all, at least in terms of rarity and value, was the original self-produced LP by the Victoria, BC punk band No Means No, all sort of hand lettered with Bic pen and so on, and in absolutely incredible condition. And I hung on to it for a number of years, and then it was, again, you start to purge and you ask yourself the question, am I ever going to listen to this record? And I listened to it now and then, but I knew I wasn't going to be spending a lot of time listening to it. And I knew other people locally loved that record and couldn't wait to get their hands on it, so I sold it. And that was worth, well, anyway, I think I sold it for many, many, many times what I spent on the original whole box of 100 records in the first place. So that was a happy thing. Yeah, right. What are your thoughts on the PBS series Jazz? I've got to confess I've actually never seen it. I watched baseball, I watched the Civil War. I found both of those a bit turgid and a bit draggy. And I'd also heard bad things about the Jazz series, the fact that, he ends it just when, in my view, things kind of get interesting. So I've never seen it. You want to change my mind? Please use the comment section. Yeah, next question. Why does everyone piss on Wynton Marsalis? I think the reason why people were down on Wynton when he first arrived is that he was pretty full of himself, and he was, not pulling punches and putting people down who had accomplished a lot in the field, blaming, I think, musicians for the state of jazz, when I think the state of jazz by 1980 was due to other factors beyond the quality and the caliber of the musicians who've been playing jazz at the time. In other words, I think what happened to jazz was bigger than something that musicians could do anything about. On top of that, not only was he dumping on these people, but he was making music which was fairly derivative. So, if you wanted to be rude about him, you could say, he was kind of the Greta Van Fleet of jazz. Personally, I have nothing against him, and I appreciate that he's an educator and he does a lot to kind of keep jazz in the public eye. Those are good things. I have none of his records. I don't really listen to him, and I'm not sure why I would listen to a new traditionalist when there's still so much of the traditional music from the great era of jazz that I haven't even listened to yet. Right, Blue, what are your thoughts on smooth jazz? What did Duke Ellington say? There's only two kinds of music, good music and bad music. I think it's kind of tough to define what smooth jazz is. Jazz in the 70s, I think the boundaries between jazz and other kinds of music, R&B, funk, ambient music, all those boundaries start to blur. I think the kind of jazz that I don't like is insipid jazz. And I can find insipid jazz in almost all eras. I can find insipid hard bop. I can find insipid swing. I can find insipid free jazz, for that matter. I'm sure if I looked hard enough. I know everybody's got a different gag reflex about music that one can encounter in the 1970s, but mine is probably a bit different than some of my viewers. I'm very fond of the Creed Taylor stuff that crossed over quite heavily at times into the R&B and funk lanes. On the other hand, I absolutely cannot stand jazz rock fusion. It just drives me crazy, all that endless noodling and frankly not swingingness, I guess. It's technically marvelous, sure, but I don't think it swings, and it's also hard music to share with others. So I guess, long story short, I'm probably okay with a lot of music that is smooth jazz or smooth jazz adjacent. I mean, I have Bob James records, for instance, although I draw the line at Kenny G. Right, next question is, What have you recently stumbled on which turned out to be excellent? A random find that turned out to be a real keeper? Good question. Two easy answers. One, Frank Foster's record, Manhattan Fever. I picked it up in a record store in Manhattan because it was a Blue Note record I didn't know about. I knew nothing about him, and I was a little bit skeptical because it was kind of a late 60s effort. It's fantastic. It is really one of the best records I bought in the last couple of years. Love it. It's hard boppy, but it's also got a funk feel to it as well. Really, really enjoyable. The other one was Chico Freeman's record, Spirit Sensitive. Now, I knew Chico Freeman was a great artist. I knew this already. I hadn't listened to a lot of his stuff, and for reasons which are kind of complicated, it wasn't really that possible to even for me to stream it at the time when I saw it in the record store. I just grabbed it thinking, you know, I just have a feeling this is an India navigation record. It's going to be good. And not only was it good, it's phenomenal. It is probably the best record that I've ever physically bought in a store in the last 5 years at any price whatsoever. And I really didn't know much about it at all. So those two for me were two real finds. Right, Blue. How do you listen to an album? How long do you stay with it before going to the next album? I would say that the record I'm listening to at any particular point probably stays in rotation for about a week. It depends what's going on in my life. If I'm super busy with work, it might stay there for longer. If I'm, lounging around and listening to lots of records, it might just stay there for 2 or 3 days. In any event, if it's a record I'm into, it almost certainly gets played 3, 4, 5 times before I put it away and file it properly. Yeah, well, now, related question. What are your overall listening habits, especially when there's so much good music? I think we are all done a great disservice due to the fact that the internet has basically done away with the brokerage function, if you want to call it that record labels used to play. Now, I know you can hear all kinds of people talking smack about the tyranny and the unfairness of record labels back in the day, and there was some of that too. But the reality was that music is a business, and these people were in the business of finding good music that lots of people would want to hear. In other words, record labels, and there were some smart and talented and gifted and musically aware people in many cases, not all, many cases running these labels, record labels added value. And now we're all supposed to be the people adding values, little entrepreneurs seeking out stuff in the little nooks and crannies of the internet here and there to pull together some kind of comprehensive musical picture. So the reality is you have all these young creators and young innovators basically playing music in near anonymity, whereas mainstream radio and the concert scene is basically given over to favoring the same small number of interchangeable acts who all charge top dollar. Now, I think to be fair, that's probably less true of jazz than it is of pop music. I have the usual debates that we all have, I think, with certainly with young people in my life about what's happened to the music industry today. I'm not one of these people who says all music today is terrible. I just think it's hard to find the good music today. It's harder to find than it was, and that's because of the changes in the structure of the music industry. There was something really beautiful, I think, is something really beautiful about record stores, but back in the day it was the only place where you and your friends went to buy music and where you heard about different kinds of music and so on, and you're there sharing information. Now it's much more atomized, and we've lost something, just as we've lost something, I think, with the decline of newspapers. What we've lost is the curation function, right? That expert curation, which delivers to you something which, yes, might marginalize certain viewpoints, but in general delivers something of acceptably high quality on a regular basis served up to you. I say all this, I haven't even answered the question, what are my listening habits? Well, at home, I listen to vinyl almost exclusively. If my wife and I are listening to music together, we're often streaming things and experimenting and playing Name That Tune and that sort of stuff. If I'm in the car, I'm usually streaming albums which I've downloaded and which are records that I have physically at home. When I'm researching music, I'm streaming it on various services, although I find YouTube is more useful than the other streaming services because so much of the music I buy these days is relatively niche and rare, and as I mentioned before, it's kind of hard to find a lot of those records in their original form on streaming services. I almost never listen to the radio except the CBC, and I find one of the advantages of being a Canadian and not really understanding freedom is being able to enjoy a truly excellent public broadcasting service. All right, Blue, are you addicted to the next album? I am absolutely not addicted to the next album. In fact, my tendency, if I hear an artist I like, is immediately to gravitate to the oldest record, the first record that they ever put out. Righto, what is your take on single tracks versus whole albums? In the years that I didn't have a vinyl collection, approximately between 2000 and 2015, I felt a huge loss, which I realized was the loss of the album experience. I talked about that a bit earlier. When I was a teenager and I would buy a record, I would always tell my friends, and it was usually true, that there might have been a hit song on the record, but there was another song on that record which I found which I liked even better than the hit song. That was normally true. I also have a brain which logs music in certain sequences and order and certain times and places. I remember where I was when I heard a very large number of individual tracks. So when I listen to a record, I know the song that's coming next. And I can usually even tell you exactly how much space there is in between one track and the next because I know how the sequence goes. So yeah, I am all about records, not about playlists. Playlists have their place, which usually begin and end with a party when I haven't got time to get up and change records. Yeah, right. Have you heard Nalis and Ephro yet? She would make Alice proud. Her and Yusuf Days and the whole contemporary jazz scene in London is popping off. I have indeed. I have one of her records. I think she is wonderful. Right, next question's a bit confrontational, mate. How on earth did you not give 5 out of 5 to Promises? You know, I'm a huge Pharoah Sanders fan, like a huge Pharoah Sanders fan, and I really wanted to give 5 out of 5 to that record. But I have to say, you know, Pharoah did his best, considering, frankly, he was pretty near the end. And more to the point, I have to say I'm not sure how profound Floating Points' contribution to that record actually was. You know, I remember being very, very excited about 10 years ago, well, 12 years ago, for the release of the Black Sabbath reunion record 13. I really, really wanted that record to be great. Tried to convince myself that it was. It's a pretty good record. It's not a great record. And I've come to terms with that over time. And I think that's the same with Promises. I think over time, critical opinion of that record relative to Pharoah's other oeuvre will dim. Yeah, now this next question is a bit tactical, mate. Read the spoken part of your videos. Is the text written out in advance and read from a screen during the recording? I cannot believe that is actually improvised on the spot. Is the text written out in advance? Well, yes and no. I always have a script. It's usually fairly well worked out bullet points, but I don't read it. I will spend some time reading what I've written, and then I will just deliver a memorized portion to the camera. And if I screw that up, I'll do another version. And so that means that most of my raw videos are about 30 to 40 minutes length because I usually have to have 2 or 3 goes or maybe 4 goes at a particular paragraph before I nail it, to the extent that I ever do nail it. Yeah, right. Your videos have got lots of interesting historical background and great photos. What are the sources that you use? What sources do I use? Pretty much anything I can get my hands on. Increasingly these days, I have a lot of knowledge acquired over time, so I'm less reliant on research than I was maybe at the beginning. I will start with Wikipedia, not because it's the font of all knowledge, but because it gives usually a little framework of information about, you know, discography and early life and so on. And then I move on and flesh it out. I rely heavily on interviews of artists. If you're lucky, they've been given, you know, and they've been made an NEA Jazz Master, and that means it's a long biographical interview they've done as part of that. But there are lots of other interviews you can read. I am a voracious consumer of back issues of Downbeat, which is all archived on the internet and makes fascinating reading. Books, of course, are a great source, but I don't want to have to buy someone's biography every time I do a video, so, you know, I do what I can. In terms of the music itself, as you may have noticed, I've shrunken down the critical part of the videos to be able to expand the historical piece because, frankly, who needs to know what I think about the music? If I'm talking about the record, it's probably a good record. But I never rely on other people's assessment of the music. I always listen to the record multiple times through. I form my own opinions. I make my own comparisons and linkages to other kinds of music. And then before I finish the script for a review, I always like to make sure that I've got at least one tidbit in there, one interesting thing, which most people don't know about that artist. And that's tricky because when you find those things, you have to find a second source, because often you'll find that someone has just invented something salacious or made a logical leap. And I learned a long time ago doing this not to take liberties when describing the lives of real people who, are real people and have real families out there and all the rest of it. So if I do say something, I've found a second source to verify that tidbit. Sometimes too, I'll dig into a particular incident to try and find much richer detail than normally you could find. Like, can I find pictures of the location? Can I find other things that were going on? Like, what's specific about that neighborhood in Chicago or what have you? A little bit of historical research, I find, in terms of viewer feedback, goes a long way. And finally, I always try and see if I can put in some context which is non-musical. But I think that's important because jazz was at its peak, to my mind, at a very difficult time for the United States. A very vibrant time, but a very difficult time. Socially for the United States, a lot of changes in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And a lot of jazz musicians in particular, who of course, mostly are black, are very conflicted, or were very conflicted about the country they were growing up in, that they were born in, and how it treated them, despite the fact that they were one of the most substantial sets of contributors to the culture of that country. So that's not something you can gloss over, but conversely, there are also some incredible moments of what you might call unity and camaraderie and triumph of the human spirit within jazz to counteract some of that tension and negativity before. All of that sort of social piece, I think, is really important, and I think, for me anyway, it really enriches my understanding of the music, of the advantages that some people had and the disadvantages that other people have. And I don't think, if I can editorialize for a second, that you can truly separate an understanding of jazz from an understanding of American social history, and I would feel kind of fraudulent if I was sitting here and just, presenting the music like it wasn't played by real people during a real time that was of great significance in lots of other ways. As for the photos, well, there's a lot of photos kicking around on the internet, and having researched it, I'm comfortable with the way that I use them in terms of it being fair use. These are essentially for educational purposes. It's very difficult in many cases to find the authorship of the photographs, and it would be so time consuming to do that for every photo that I would use that it would almost defeat the purpose of doing the videos in the first place. But that is still something I feel I need to do a better job of, and that's something I will be changing going forward. Sometimes I create my own photos. Well, photos of photos. I'll take photographs of record jackets. I often do that when I'm talking about an artist about whom there is almost no record on the internet, and there are quite a few people in that category. Yeah, right. Now look, mate, a great deal of time and effort must go into the preparation and production of your videos. What is your motivation? What is your main satisfaction in remaining engaged in your channel? It takes about 10 hours to do a 10-minute video these days, start to finish, so it's not that bad. And I've gotten a lot faster because I have a bigger, I guess, sort of bedrock of knowledge to rely on. In terms of my motivation, I think it's changed. When I started the channel, it wasn't even a channel. It was just a way for me to force myself to listen to a lot of the records which I'd acquired, and to do so in a way which would be helpful if I either kept the records or if I sold them or what have you, to have some kind of a commentary on the record. And so it was about getting through all the records I had. It wasn't about jazz per se, and I guess that was true for the first year of the channel or so. But again, as I think I intimated earlier, what began to change was I was, first of all, becoming more and more passionate about jazz, but secondly, I was getting such great feedback from jazz viewers that I realized, I kind of found my tribe here. And I think that's, because, as I mentioned, I've been on this journey for 10 years, digging into jazz, learning more and more, and finding that sharing what I found was the best way of properly learning it myself. And I think that energy and the interest has been communicated through the medium, and I think it's been appreciated by viewers. So now I'm in this fairly fortunate situation of, not having a huge audience, but having more viewers than I used to have. a lot of very engaged viewers, and that's the best part. And I really enjoy interacting with you, those that are routinely engaging. I've made some great friendships. I have had some great opportunities come my way. And there's just an energy which I get from that interaction. And that, I guess, is my motivation, just to kind of keep that going, keep learning, keep sharing, and keep learning more from the people I'm interacting with. Yeah, Blue, it is a relief that your videos, even the longer ones, are not interrupted by annoying adverts. Do you receive any financial compensation for your channel from YouTube? Yes, I do make money from this channel. No, I do not make very much money from this channel. Once you get 1,000 subscribers and once you are getting 4,000 or more hours of views per year, YouTube starts to pay you. Not very much money. I think in the last year, I think my average is something like $4 a day. So it's not exactly approaching my consulting rate. I could probably bump that to $5 a day if I put ads in the middle of my videos, but I don't really want to do that. I would hate that, and I'm sure other people would too. My motivation for accepting payment from YouTube in the first place was really just to be able to cover off my vinyl habit, my vinyl buying habit, and I'm not quite there yet for that. But again, this is a hobby and not a retirement plan. Yeah, Blue, you are an avid collector with a very rich collection of vinyl, if I may say. I suspect this is not a cheap hobby. Do you have an idea of the average monthly budget that goes to your hobby and collection? You know, the problem with that question is that there's a reasonable probability that my wife will watch this video. But in all fairness, I would say that I, these days, probably spend up to $200 a month on records. There have been a few times in the past, obviously, when I've gone over that, particularly if I got in some kind of, mania, some kind of binge, from some particular artist. There was also a period a number of years ago where I was building up my collection and I would suddenly decide, okay, I really want to get a bunch of records off this label, and I was spending more than $200 a month at that time. These days, for reasons of space, but also for reasons of what you might call, narrowing interest, I'm much more selective about what I bring in. I'm far more likely these days to buy two $100 records in a month than 10, $20 records. The so-called median value of my collection on Discogs in Canadian dollars is supposedly $65,000, but as I've mentioned before on this channel, I don't really think that's a real number. A lot of my records I got for much less than book value because I got them at auction, and it would be very, 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 very time consuming to recoup that supposed amount of $65,000 if I set out to sell them all individually. You would never get that selling them bulk. I think the best you could probably hope to get for a collection this size would be something like 10 or 15 grand, something like that. Once again, a hobby, not a retirement plan. Right, mate, are you satisfied with your current audio system? Do you sometimes look for opportunities to upgrade it? Or does the playback quality of the audio hardware not concern you at all? When we installed this listening room about, a year and a half ago or so, the idea was that I would spend on a completely new rig. However, when Mrs. Reviews had finished furnishing the room, the entire budget for the new stereo was gone. And this is the problem with public-private partnerships. So I was a little crestfallen, but I did the math to figure out what it would cost to replace my existing setup, and I realized, actually, I've got a pretty good stereo here, if I can use that antiquated term, and it sounds pretty good to me. I'm not too fussy. I know there are people out there who've got their turntables, suspended in a vat of gelatin, and they listen while they're sitting on a chair constructed entirely of tuning forks, but that's not me. It's never going to be me. I have a hearing aid. I'm conscious of my own limitations, and this, to me, has plenty of bass, plenty of crispness, allows me to enjoy the music, and that's really all I need. Right, I've got a long list here, so just pop off whenever you feel like it. Who is your favourite organ player? Dr. Lonnie Smith. Pianist? Horace Silver. Alto player? Cannonball. Tenor sax player? Coltrane. Bass player? Scott LaFaro. Trumpeter? Miles Davis. Drummer? Elvin Jones. Guitarist? Joao Gilberto. Trombonist? Curtis Fuller. Vibraphonist? Victor Feldman. Trio album. Sunday at the Village Vanguard. Quartet album. A Love Supreme. Quintet album. Curtis Counts Group, Landslide. Orchestral album. Out of the Cool. Vocal jazz album. Mel Torme sings Fred Astaire. Mate, what do you think of the Swedish jazz scene in the 1950s and 1960s? I think it's pretty cool. I'm a big fan of Lars Hulin. I know that Stockholm was a regular stop on the European jazz tour circuit by American jazz musicians in the 50s and 60s. A lot of great music was recorded by American artists in Sweden as well as by Swedes. Frankly, it's actually something I'd like to know a lot more about, and spurred by this question, I think I'm going to do more digging in the near future. Right, Blue. Can you tell us about some of the records that you wanted to profile on the channel, but about which you weren't able to gather enough information, or perhaps some other reason which caused you to shelve the project? I have this little folder, kind of a guilty folder or a sad folder on my computer, which is basically working drafts with a whole bunch of records where I kind of got halfway through a review and it's sitting there. And every now and then I go back and I resuscitate one of those, but mostly it's just a bit of a graveyard. To be honest, normally that happens when I realize halfway through that I'm not really that passionate about the record, and I don't want to do a video where I'm pretending to be excited about something that I'm not excited about. So at that point I go, let's move to a different record. Or sometimes it's just a bit daunting. I think, as some of you know, about a year ago, exactly a year ago, I was threatening to do this video on Duke Ellington's pre-war music, but I realized just how little I knew about Duke Ellington at the time. And I don't want to make a video about Duke, particularly about Duke, unless I know enough to say something that's useful, because it's a rich topic and an important topic, and I don't want to screw it up, and I don't want to come off saying, a bunch of half-assed stuff. So I've been listening to music, I've been streaming it, I've been buying records, I've been talking to people, I've been reading books, and when the time is right, then I'll do it. Funnily enough, though, I guess there's a contrary piece of that, which is that if there isn't much information about a record, that usually doesn't stop me. In fact, I find that a challenge. If I find there's a record that's got no Wikipedia entry, that's got no review on AllMusic, that hasn't been reviewed, or has very little by any of the other reference books that I've got, then that's a huge challenge, and I get excited about it because it means that if I can bring something forward about that record, that's actually providing a service to the world, I guess, or certainly to the little niche of jazz people. So an example of that is the video I did on Heiser Walker, the musician from Chicago, or Evanston, I guess. I could find nothing about this guy. Like literally, well, not literally nothing, but so little about this guy. He'd been on a Young and Holt record. He had a couple of his own records, and then that's it. There's no photographs of it, or very few. There was a video of him backing up Fred Astaire, but like nothing. So I dug and dug and dug, and I was reading obituaries, and I was researching his family members, and eventually I got in contact with the family, and I interviewed his nephew, I believe it was, and that was a great source of information about this guy's life. Anyway, I did the video, and I'm quite happy with that video. And then what was very gratifying is that other family members of Heiser Walker saw the video, and they're commenting saying, wow, this is so great that you did this about my uncle. We didn't even know this, etc. That's a really good feeling to do a little bit of original research like that. So when I find a record that nobody knows anything about, or an artist that nobody knows anything about, that actually gets me really excited. Yeah, Cobber, an opening shot shows you the address where the A Great Day in Harlem photo was taken. Was that a remarkable experience? Now, funnily enough, that is not actually in Harlem at that location. It is in Manhattan, but it's at 96 and 98 St. Mark's Place, further down in, I guess, Midtown, or maybe a bit lower down. Maybe it's the Lower East Side. I'm not quite sure of my New York nomenclature. Anyway, it's St. Mark's Place, 96, 98 St. Mark's Place, a building which was used as the cover for the Led Zeppelin record, Physical Graffiti. They had to alter it somewhat because it's actually too tall. They had to chop out a floor. But that's the building. And that's a little bit of a window into my own nerdiness, because I have a few other photos where I've recreated a famous album cover. And in fact, my wife and I once had a minor falling out about the fact that she would not work with me to recreate the cover of the Freewheeling Bob Dylan, even though I'd found the right street in Manhattan. She, I think, probably tells that story with a different angle. Right, Blue, you've got an opening shot of a smiling woman with grey hair standing in front of record shelves. Who is she? So that is a lady whose name I don't know, but she runs a jazz listening bar in Kanazawa, Japan. It's called York Jazz and Drinks. It's probably the best little jazz listening bar in Kanazawa, I would say. And if you don't know about Japanese jazz listening bars, then I encourage you to look them up. All of those are her records. They're all first pressings. They were all acquired in the 1950s and 1960s. She, I think, she's in her later 70s actually. As you can see from the spines, it's a pretty epic collection of music. And my son and I spent a very pleasant evening there, him attempting to speak Japanese with her and me drinking whiskey. Right, mate. Have you ever heard an audio note system? Yes or no? Nope, sorry I haven't. Yeah, Blue, I was wondering if you'd do a label review on the GRP label. Seems like they kind of took over from CTI in the 80s and 90s. I must confess that I have no records on the GRP label, and normally I only do a label review once I not only have a fair number of records from a label, but I've also listened to them a lot and feel I can speak from my own authority, not just reflected or researched information from other people. But having said all that, you've intrigued me, so I'll check it out. Yeah, mate, how is it that this year Arsenal have snatched defeat from the jaws of victory with such regularity? Why do we watch sport? Is it because we don't have enough reasons to suffer heartbreak and poor self-esteem? Personally, when it comes to Arsenal, I've drawn a veil over this season. I remain certain that we are only 2 signings away from world domination. So, next year beckons. And meanwhile, I know this question comes from a baseball fan. So let me exact my revenge by saying that there is absolutely no way the Mets can fail to win the pennant, and there is no way they can fail to go on to win the World Series this year. It's a certainty. Nothing can go wrong. Right, Blue, do you have any vinyl by Jimmy Lunceford? If you do, I'd love you to make a video about him. I don't have any Jimmy Lunceford records, but as it happens, I've become quite curious about him. He's mentioned in Ted Gioia's History of Jazz as kind of this, peripheral figure. As one of the great band leaders of the 1930s. But he was very, very popular with dancers because his orchestra had an incredible rhythmic sense, and I've streamed quite a bit of his stuff lately, in part because of your question, but not exclusively. And I really like it, and I am going to be acquiring some Jimmy Lunceford, so stay tuned for a Jimmy Lunceford review. Right, Blue. I've been a viewer for 2 to 3 years, and I'm curious about your switch from rock reviews to jazz reviews. Did you start out to have a rock channel, then switch to jazz? What's the deal? I've talked a little bit about how I gravitated towards jazz, but I will confess that my move towards jazz was not only motivated by my love for jazz, it was also motivated by my experiences dealing with rock and roll fans, typically dudes, on the internet, who I will say I find, compared to jazz fans, are highly opinionated and not necessarily particularly well informed. And on top of that, they are also fairly rude. So for instance, if I do a jazz review, kind of comment I might get is, hey, thanks for the review. Did you know that so-and-so also recorded with this guy? And I really recommend you listen to this record because I think you'll really like it. That's, very typical of the kind of positive, pro-social kinds of comments I get on jazz reviews. When I do a rock and roll review, the typical comments I get are things like this. What do you mean 3.5 stars, you douche? So in other words, with jazz, I feel like I found my tribe. I love rock and roll, but I have to say I don't really love rock and roll fans. It's just a lot of toxic measurement. Right, Blue, I've noticed you gravitating more these days towards West Coast jazz, hard bop, and more straight jazz, and less free jazz and spiritual. I'd like to know why, and I'm wondering if it's because you're getting older. When I started to do all this stuff, I was heavily into spiritual jazz. I mean, heavily, and I still am. I still dig it, and I still listen to it regularly. But my intense phase of exploration into it has probably come and gone. But that said, you can expect more spiritual jazz reviews in the future. I just try and mix things up, and I suppose I have been doing a lot of, West Coast and hard bop stuff lately. I don't feel a need to cover the entire waterfront of jazz. I'm usually doing things that I'm into at the time, but I still am regularly into spiritual jazz. I just saw the great Ravi Coltrane and Brandy Younger tribute to Alice Coltrane, that particular tour, which got me all fired up again. So you could expect more reviews on spiritual jazz to come. Right, Blue, you've commented that you occasionally purge your collection, as do I. Is this an activity you're comfortable talking about? I'm absolutely comfortable about talking about purging your collection. I think it's a very healthy thing to do, and I think for several reasons. First of all, I see no merit whatsoever in collecting records for the hell of it. If a record is going to be in my house, it's because I'm going to listen to it. If I'm not going to listen to it, if I'm not going to listen to it in the next year, if there's no reasonable likelihood of that, it's a very strong candidate to be sold, removed, given away. Secondly, I would say that once you get over a certain threshold of records, I'm going to say about 2,000. I have a bit more than that, but I think that's probably the sweet spot. Some people might say a bit lower. Once you have more than that, I don't think it's reasonable to think that you're going to listen to all those records. I'm not judging. I'm just saying. And if you're not going to listen to them, why do you have them? Somebody else would probably like to listen to them. Third is a question of physical space. I'm fortunate enough to live in a house where we have enough room that I can display my whole record collection in a way which doesn't totally overwhelm either the room it's in or our house in general. Record collecting should enhance your life. It shouldn't constrain it. So accepting that it is useful and necessary to purge, how do you go about it? Well, for me, it's a process of untangling my emotions. I mean, it's like the whole sunk cost thing, you know. Yes, this was a record you looked for a long time. Yes, you used to really like it. Yes, maybe you spent a lot of money on it. But if it's just going to sit there for the next 2 years, why? If you can get some money for it, great. If you can't, well, maybe give it to somebody who wants it. Maybe lend it to somebody with the expectation that you're probably not going to get it back. Ask yourself, am I honestly going to play this record in the next year? And based on the honest answer to that question, you know how to act. To give an example of how I'm struggling a bit with that question right now, talk about free jazz. I don't have a ton of free jazz. I probably have, maybe 50 to 60 records, which are pretty out, let's just say. Now, I'm always going to keep some of those because they're super significant, and I'm going to want to jump back in and listen to them and so on. So, for instance, Ornette Coleman's free jazz for sure, some Archie Shepp records, and so on. But I will say, bluntly, I've got almost all of Coltrane's work. Some of his later stuff is hard work to listen to. Some of Anthony Braxton's work is hard work to listen to. Maybe all of it's hard work to listen to. Some of Don Cherry's work is hard music to listen to. And it doesn't mean anything bad about me, I'm happy to say, if I decide that I don't want to do that work and maybe I want to listen to music that's just frankly easier to listen to. It doesn't mean anything bad about me. And if somebody else wants to listen to that, if they want to do that work, then they're welcome to do it. So at some point I'm purging, not all of it, but some of it, and making room for music that I'm far more likely to put on a turntable. Mate, I find Mose Allison and Jimmy Rolls conspicuous by their absence on your channel. Are they not to your taste? I, in fact, have not only a Jimmy Rolls record, but several Mose Allison records. And the Jimmy Rolls record in particular is one which I love. It's the one which has got a funny title. It's like music for jazz for people who hate jazz or something like that. It's fantastic, and I think it's a greatly undervalued record. The Mose Allison records, Mose I like, although I have to say he's a bit like John Mayall for me in that he's a white guy who sings the blues in kind of an uncompelling fashion, and I think he gets away with it only because he's a white guy, but he's not particularly good at singing the blues. But musically, I think his music is quite good, and I think he's a very inventive composer and all the rest of it. So nothing against either Mose or Jimmy, and who knows, maybe I'll do a review on one of them or both of them in the near future. Right, can you point me in a direction to learn more about the band Funk Inc? Funk Inc. I have to confess, this is a band that I have felt for a long time that I should like, and I've listened to their stuff quite often thinking, okay, maybe this is the time that the penny really drops for me. But the unfortunate truth is I'm not that wild about them, sorry to say. I do have a sneaking suspicion that they sounded a lot better live than they did in the studio, because I find their studio work kind of leaves me cold. And I think maybe because I don't know that Prestige Records knew as much about recording a funk band as, say, Creed Taylor did. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Right, Cobber, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the Smithsonian Collection of Classic Jazz for 1973. And I reckon my broader question would be, what are your thoughts on historical curation and perhaps the nature of the compilation LP in itself? The Smithsonian Collection of Classic Jazz from 1973 is not something that I've ever heard of, so I don't have thoughts. But as for my thoughts on historical curation, and I guess more generally you're saying the compilation LP, the whole process of compiling best ofs, I think it's worthy, because I think there are a lot of people out there who are not going to be chasing down original albums and really want only to have the best representation of an artist's work. And I think we all have come across compilation records that we think, yeah, that really kind of nails it for that artist. If you had to pick 15 songs, those are the best 15. And I think we've all of us come across compilations that are really crummy, you know, that miss out several what we consider to be fantastic records. In fact, I suppose that that's maybe the more typical response, is to say this compilation is lacking my favorite song or what have you. So I think for a lot of people, for the broad mass of music lovers out there, there's no shame in compilation albums, and I think it's a very worthy pursuit to pull them together, because at least the music of that musician is being listened to by people who may have only a passing interest in the music, but it's being listened to. If it deserves it, that's great. Personally, I have almost no compilations in my collection, and the only exceptions to those are where you have no choice but to have compilations, in particular pre-war jazz. Otherwise, I just find them frustrating. I find there's too many different historical eras and styles all wrapped in together, and all I can do is think about the songs that aren't on that compilation. So that's the 5th anniversary video. Thank you again for all your support. Thank you for your questions, and I'll see you next time.